I rise to speak of the atrocities that are being committed every day by the Syrian government against its own citizens, thousands of whom have stood bravely, month after month, against unspeakable violence, simply to ask for basic political freedoms we take for granted in this country. And I rise to speak of the indefensible and inexplicable support of this brutal regime by Russia. It has now been almost 1 full year since the Syrian uprising began in March 2011. By some reports, over 6,000 innocent people, civilians, have lost their lives in Syria. The exact number may never be known. Humanitarian groups have been prohibited from even assisting the wounded, and reporters prohibited from telling the story to the world. Syria's third largest city, Homs, has been bombarded with rockets and bombs by the Syrian military for over 3 weeks, with scores of deaths, shortages of food and medical supplies. One report describes 11 rockets, slamming into a single apartment building in the space of 2 minutes. As soon as the barrage stopped and people started to rush to get away, it started again, killing even more. The result, a horrific trail of dead and dying in this building from the 5th floor on down. Those killed in Syria included 2 Western journalists. Some suspect they might have been targeted. The murder of a well-known video blogger, Rami al-Said, supported that claim. In this photo, you may see the results of the Syrian government's bombardment of the city of Homs. Sadly, this is likely one of the many burial ceremonies that the people of that city have had to endure recently. Just a few days ago, it was reported the bodies of 64 men were discovered in a mass grave on the outskirts of the city, and the women and children who were with them have gone missing. The Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Syria, working under the UN, submitted its most recent report on February 22nd. It said the Syrian government has accelerated the killing of its own people, particularly in Homs, resulting in the deaths of nearly 800 civilians in the first 2 weeks of February alone. From the report, it is said, on several occasions in January and February 2012, entire families, children and adults, were brutally murdered in Homs. It is also noted that protesters have been arrested without cause, tortured, and even summarily executed. In October, Senators Cardin, Menendez, Boxer, and I sent a letter to the ambassador to the United Nations from the United States, Susan Rice, urging that the Syrian government be referred to the International Criminal Court for possible indictment for war crimes. Certainly the evidence for such charges is overwhelming and continues to this day. Assad has paid lip service to reforms, like the sham constitutional referendum last Sunday, and the document's most important changes included giant caveats that they would, in effect, maintain the status quo as it exists in Syria. One example is Assad's introduction of presidential term limits to 2 terms of 7 years each. But the clock wouldn't start until Assad's current term expires in 2014, giving him 14 more years in office, a total of 28 years. Incomprehensible. Secretary Clinton aptly described the referendum as a cynical ploy, to say the least. On February 17th, the Senate unanimously passed a resolution strongly condemning the government of Syria's brutal and unjustifiable use of force against civilians, including unarmed women and children, and its violations of the fundamental human rights and dignity of the people of Syria. Additionally, the UN General Assembly on February 16th passed a resolution by a vote of 137 to 12 that strongly condemned continuing widespread and systematic human rights violations by the Syrian authorities. And last Friday, more than 60 governments and organizations gathered in Tunis under the Friends of Syria rubric, and they called for an immediate ceasefire, the provision of humanitarian aid, and a UN peacekeeping force. The international community has coalesced in support of the Syrian people. I'd like to recognize once again the leadership of the Arab League in building this consensus against the bloodshed. Even some UN Security Council members, such as India, South Africa, that early on had concerns about speaking out, can no longer stand by silently as the killing continues. In the most recent UN Security Council vote earlier this month, they chose to do the right thing and to vote in favor of the latest resolution backing the Arab League peace plan. However, sad as it is to report, this resolution was vetoed by Russia and China. The exceptions to the international solidarity and support of the Syrian people have been Iran, China, and Russia. While both Iran and China's support for the Assad regime is deplorable, it is even worse in the case of Russia, for it is Russia that has the most blood of innocent Syrian women and children on its hands. Russia is not only protecting President Assad as he kills his own people, but it continues to supply him with the weapons to do it. How can any responsible nation take such action? In an interview following the Friends of Syria meeting, Secretary of State Clinton said, and I quote, "It's quite distressing to see two permanent members of the Security Council using their veto when people are being murdered, women, children, brave young men. It's just despicable." And I ask, whose side are they on? Russia has chosen to align itself with a murderous regime, to impede democratic reform, and to facilitate the killing of innocent people by putting more and more weapons into the hands of those eager to pull the trigger. Despite 6,000 innocent civilians dying, despite the overwhelming international consensus that Assad has lost legitimacy to lead the Syrian people, Russia continues to sell arms to Syria. According to media reports, shipping data shows at least 4 cargo ships since December that left the Black Sea port of Oktyabrsk used by Russian arms exporters for arms shipments. They've headed for or reached the Syrian port of Tartus. Separately was the Chariot, a Russian ship which docked at the Cypriot port of Limassol during stormy weather in mid-January. It promised to change its destination in accordance with the European Union ban on weapons to Syria, but ours, after leaving Limassol, reset its course for Syria. The Russian arming of the Syrian murderers continues. A Cypriot source said that ship was carrying a load of ammunition, and a European security source said the ship was hauling ammunition and sniper rifles of the kind used increasingly by Syrian government forces against protesters. I want to show one other photograph here. This one is of Russian warships, an aircraft carrier, docked at the Syrian port of Tartus on January 8th. What we couldn't turn into a poster is the video clip showing the Russian warship captains being greeted like royalty by the Syrian Minister of Defense, who went out to personally welcome their ship. Mr. President, rebel soldiers and an official who defected from the government of Syria say Moscow's small arms trade with Damascus is booming, and that the government doubled its military budget in 2011 to pay for the brutal response to this opposition. That said, Russia is in a unique position. It has President Assad's trust and confidence, maybe more than any other country. Should Russia choose, it could use this power and influence to constructively broker a real transition and an end to this bloodshed. The longer President Assad holds power in Syria, the more innocent people will die. The window for a more peaceful transition and ending is closing. Now's the time for Russia to lead in the right direction, to be a responsible global partner, and to be part of a solution in ending the carnage, bloodshed, and death in Syria.